Hello, friends. It's Chapo.
And Twiggs completely gave away the ghost and just handed everything to the Texas Rangers. But he never really did much for the Confederacy because he was just old balls at that point. It's really the Civil War. The top Civil War guys were like, yeah, they were like, lieutenants basically at this point.
So it's as we've alluded to, it's essentially a two-pronged invasion of Mexico. Taylor moving the north to south, and then Scott, after the amphibious landing, going overland, east to west, and taking Veracruz, and then finally in September of 1847, taking Mexico or Mexico City.
Yeah, it's really an impressive undertaking in the kind of technical sense. Scott was he would have loved Excel. He was that kind of guy. He was a planner. He was meticulous, old fuss and feathers. He was vain, physically vain, large, imposing man. Actually, had served all the way since the War of 1812. Had a really extended Civil War career before his final kind of comic deployment in 1861 when he is so gout ridden he can barely even walk to the meetings with Lincoln at the beginning of the war. But he was a tactical, I think it's fair to say, I don't know, genius, but he was impressive tactical commander, sort of organizing all of this, helped by the sort of even the early vestiges of the war machine. But yeah, Veracruz is a hard city to take because they have this massive castle, San Juan de Ula, or I said that horribly wrong, San Juan de Ulua. Anyway, let's not try to say that a third time. They have a big castle looking over the harbor that's like totally impregnable, apparently to ship to bombardment. And it's not an easy, it's not like the U.S. had a lot of experience doing amphibious landings in a totally hostile environment. But they assemble a massive flotilla, again, for the time, but it is massive. And by anyone's estimation, in a contemporary sense, and they just bomb the hell out of Veracruz. I mean, they do a classic kind of, shock and awe. This is what the U.S. Army does best: is lob shit at cities from very far away. And bombs going off in marketplaces. Yeah, of course they're aiming for munition stuff, but I mean, if you want to talk about collateral damage in there wasn't even any dogma of like smart bombs at this point. It's just fire away with the heavy guns. And so yeah, Veracruz surrenders more quickly than expected under this very intense, heavy bombardment, and they end up, the Mexicans, even in their sort of strong fortified castle, end up yielding. And so then once Scott gets to Veracruz, he takes a long time. I mean, he's not quick. This is not lightning war. He takes 6 months to meticulously wind his way up. He wants to get out of Veracruz pretty quickly to avoid the yellow fever, but then he gets up into the highlands and he really takes his time. And Santa Anna, I don't want to say to his credit, but Santa Anna is giving him, heavy static at every way. There's Scott. It's not a cakewalk into Mexico City. Scott has to fight at Cerro Gordo. He has to fight at Churubusco. He has to fight outside the gates of Mexico City. 6 months later, he finally gets there. Actually, basically not so differently, retreading the route that Cortez took, when he was on his way to sort of make the conquest of the Aztecs in a resonance that is not lost on these Americans. I think Polk, before office, this is a very Trump move. He gets a picture. So one of the generals gives him a picture of Cortez and he hangs it in the Oval Office as a kind of, sort of acknowledged reference to, I'm the new Cortez. And Mexicans also sort of talk about this as a sort of a new invasion on the model of Cortez. And yeah, it's bloody and it's time consuming, but Scott manages to sort of make his way through those mountains across difficult terrain and sees the halls of the Montezumas, another phrase that then becomes etched in the U.S. Marine song or whatever. It's these resonances from Cortez and the Aztecs, and then there's a whole other story about how just like Taylor's army took Monterrey and sat there for a long time, Scott's army takes Mexico City and sits there for the better part of a year. As the Mexican government has basically collapsed, but it's very difficult to figure out how the end game after the invasion.
But what we get finally in February of 1848 is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gives to the United States California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Wyoming. Just a huge buff of America's stats across the board there in the West.
Yeah.
And sets the stage for a political battle over what to do with those territories, and also sets the stage for generations of political instability in Mexico itself after that.
Most of the Pac-10, the better part of the Big 12, and then not to mention the WAC and the Mountain West Conference. So, I mean, imagine sports, without Southern California and Oklahoma.
They'd all be playing
Imagine,
soccer.
yeah,
There'd be no high school football or college football to be found. It'd be horrible.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, this is contentious because there's different factions in Washington that want different things, and there are some, especially a lot of the most gung ho on this are the Northwesterners. That is like the sort of Ohio and the sort of the Democrats, the expansionist Democrats from Ohio to Wisconsin, who are the sort of the heartbeat with a few Southerners of the all Mexico movement that want in these negotiations to say, hey, look, we conquered Mexico City. Let's take the whole shebang. Let's set up shop over literally this entire continent south of Canada up to the Yucatan Peninsula, which was also, by the way, in revolt against the state of Mexico, which had its own problems. I mean, we haven't even mentioned that most of this territory, a huge part of West Texas and what is now New Mexico up into Colorado and then deep into northern Mexico was really effectively controlled by Comanches at this point. The Mexican state had a really limited purchase on a lot of this land, and the kind of the ongoing Comanche raids across the 20s, 30s, and 40s really opened the door in some ways for weakening the sort of what had once been, at least by some accounts, the sort of the Mexican army had its strongest presence in northern Mexico, partly to clamp down on the restive natives, but that is both the local Mexicans and Native Americans who are fighting with the Mexican state or conducting raids. But really, the Comanches have left a lot of Mexican defenses in a shell. But alternatively, once the U.S. takes over, the Comanches themselves are a bit worn out, and the way this land is all rolled up into U.S. territory, a huge chunk of it, kind of helps facilitate a massive seizure of land from Native people too. Across this period, which I guess we should mention as part of this war. I have a colleague, a guy at Columbia, who's writing a book on the U.S. Mexico War, precisely as a kind of this guy called Jacoby, as a war, against Native Americans too, which like the War of 1812 was the Creek War, and was about as much about fighting Britain as it was, clearing out Alabama from the natives. The War of Mexico, similar function, especially in the Southwest. Anyway, all that being said, the U.S. is, after some serious revolts in Taos and in Los Angeles, among other places, is back firmly in control of all of the land that is now the U.S. And so it's hard to imagine an agreement being made at this point after all this bloodshed that wouldn't have included that land. The question is the rest of Mexico. And in the end, the envoy that they send, this guy Nicholas Trist, the instructions from Washington are vague and conflicting, and he ends up making an agreement that is Guadalupe Hidalgo, that is the borders we know now. Polk hates it, but he has to swallow it. The bulk of the country wants peace, and they want this land, and it's a relatively cheap price too.
And everything was fine after that. That's the thing to remember most importantly.
Yeah, exactly. They all lived happily ever after. The forbidden fruit went down deliciously, just like that Palo Alto root beer. Yeah.
All right.
No conflicts on the horizon for the United States.
It's all smooth sailing after that.
Yeah.
That'll do it for now, I think. In future episodes, I think we'll talk about what came next, what's where we ended up. Can't wait to talk about one of my favorite incidents in Mexican history. Good old Maximilian, the poor Austrian chump, just stitched up by Napoleon III and left to get shot down like a dog.
Man, I want to hear you do your epic German accent, but with a Spanish accent on top of it, like Maximilian speaking to his people. I'd love that. Work that up.
That's definitely going to go over well when I do that.
Yeah.
And that is all a direct consequence of this massive dismembering of a country that was already sort of in a debt imperialist relationship with European powers before the war, and then became basically a in hoc to the French afterwards, to the point where the mad lad Napoleon III actually tried to bust through the Monroe corridor because he thought that I guess he thought the Civil War would just go on forever and that we never fix it and no one would notice. But of course, that's not what happened. But that's for a future episode.